this is pretty daunting, actually, and thank you all very much for the opportunity to be with you. I always love coming to Australia and Melbourne in particular, and I come too rarely, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Quentin for the very kind words of introduction. I want to thank Justine and Andrew from the library, Ellen too, for setting up this Australian Learning Lecture, which I think is, on behalf of all of you, is something that you will welcome, and I hope I can do this first one justice. It's a real honour and rather daunting, as I say, to be asked to deliver it. I also want to say thank you for joining and welcome to the people in the State Library in Western Australia and all those watching online, as well as, of course, the audience here in the room. I should say, actually, that the most important person in the room is Ryan, actually, who's going to operate the technology now, and we should thank him in advance. He's been really, really helpful during the afternoon. I also want to thank Ellen and Andrew for the title, which they gave me and has given me plenty to think about and plenty to wrestle with over the last few months. The State Library here in Melbourne was actually founded in, and it's a magnificent building, as you can see in the picture, and you're all very familiar with it here. It's a wonderful building. I had a wonderful tour of it yesterday, and the inside is as exciting and vibrant as the outside is impressive. It was founded in 1854, when mid-Victorian faith that spreading knowledge would lead to improvements in the human condition was at its height. As it happens, that was the same year that the Northcote Trevelyan report was published, making the case for a British civil service based on merit rather than patronage. It actually prompted Queen Victoria to ask rather anxiously at the time just how far up the hierarchy merit-based appointments would go. By coincidence or not, that same year, 1854, is also famous for the first systematic use of data to solve a major health problem. By mapping the incidences of cholera during an outbreak in Soho, London, John Snow, a physician, was able to show that the source was a water pump in Broad Street. As a result, he convinced the local authority to remove the handle from the pump, after which the cholera epidemic abated. Until then, everyone, including John Snow, had believed that cholera was transmitted through what they called miasma, or bad air. Was that joy from data? Maybe not, but in place of death, at least the possibility of joy. And on your next visit to London, you can visit the pub named after the great John Snow in that very street, which is now called Broadwick Street, and raise a glass to joy and data. In the modern world, joy and data are often seen as opposites. The one creative, spontaneous, warm, even spiritual. The other scientific, bureaucratic, cold, and analytical. In part, this is because we look back to the mid-Victorian era through the historical miasma of the 20th century, during which the terrors of totalitarianism divorced scientific analysis and data from judgment and ethics. I want to argue this evening that we need to reclaim data as an ally in improving the human condition, just as those mid-Victorians believed, and that as one ingredient alongside others such as analysis, informed ethical judgment, and not least teaching and learning, data can and does bring joy. In doing so, I want to take on some popular misconceptions about data before concluding with a section specifically on the implications of my argument for teaching, learning, and education systems. But we should start with some definitions. Data, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is or are facts and statistics gathered together for reference or analysis. In the Victorian era, they made sure that such facts and statistics were gathered together in the reference sections of libraries such as the one here in Melbourne, and later in government departments. In our era, with the explosion of digital technology, facts and statistics are instantly available everywhere. The challenge is not to find them, but to discriminate the good and the well-founded from the poor and the unfounded. Look, for example, at this real-time mapping of the trains on the London Underground. Can you see the little black dots chugging along? The green arrow, by the way, indicates where the 1854 cholera outbreak took place. Can you see the trains chugging along? No doubt you can do the same, although I haven't tried with the trams in Melbourne. It's easy to see this spread of data into every corner of our lives as a threat, and there are dangers to which we shall come in a moment, but it's also possible to see it as part of a new democratization in which data is everywhere and belongs to everyone, rather than just the experts. Before we go further, though, we also need to define joy, which the OED describes as a feeling of great pleasure and happiness. It's important to my argument later to distinguish joy from fun, which is a much shallower emotion. You can feel, and we all do from time to time, profound joy. The language won't even let you say profound fun. Similarly, following a conversation with Ellen, I want to distinguish joy from success. Of course, success can lead to joy, but success, as the England cricket team constantly remind us, is transitory. More fundamentally, there are many people who experience success without ever experiencing joy, and sometimes people experience success at the expense of joy. With this background, this is where I depend on Ryan, by the way, I want to show you a brief film. While you were enjoying summer and the first day of the Boxing Day Test match here in Melbourne, which inevitably, unfortunately, Australia went on to win, in Britain, we were living through winter, and I was otherwise engaged, as you'll discover in the film. The idea of the brief film was to explore these relationships and distinctions between data, joy, fun, success, and rain. Ryan.
Some would say that a cold, wet December day in deepest, darkest Devon isn't the ideal time to go cycling. But Michael has to train for an epic bike ride next year. If he waits for better weather, he could be waiting some time. This is England after all. If this desk-bound man on the wrong side of middle age has any chance of succeeding, he has to stick to his training program. We can and do collect data on anything these days, even a cycle ride. There was a time when you just got on your bike and went. Water bottle, lights, gloves, helmet, all standard equipment. But a computer? That small addition will collect data in real time on every aspect of Michael's ride. It will map his route, tell him how far he's travelled, measure ascent, heart rate, cadence and speed, or in Michael's case, the lack of it. All this might be interesting, but does it make Michael's ride more fun or joyful? There isn't a lot of fun to be had with or without a computer. And Michael lives at the bottom of a hill, so the only way is up. Does the computer's ability to tell Michael he's going slowly and his heart rate's going through the roof make the ride more fun? Michael would say that actually it does, but that's because he's an obsessive graph-loving data freak. But that's not the same thing as joy. Fun is shallow, joy is deep. Not all cycling is uphill though. Even for Michael, there are those glorious moments of accelerating downhill. These moments may pass quickly, but Michael says they can be truly joyful, not just fun. And this time, he might not be alone.
A lot of endurance sport, at the time of execution, as it were, it's quite painful. But I think the fun in cycling, there are times in cycling where it's a real struggle, and it's a real battle, and you're grinding away, and it hurts, and it's painful, and yet you finish, and you can never quite relive the pain, and you look back and think, wow, that's brilliant, I can't wait to do that again. And you think at the time when you're doing it, it's excruciating. But I do think there's a sweet spot somewhere in there where, every now and again you go out on your bike and if you've got yourself in pretty good shape, you're riding along and it just feels exhilarating. You could be on a hill and you could be working really, really hard, close to your maximum, but you feel just in control. And you think, wow, I'm going all right here. I feel really good, even though I'm suffering. And that's fun.
But what, if anything, has that joy got to do with the data being collected? Maybe the data will help even Michael to be more successful. He's never going to win an Olympic gold for Team GB, but apparently he's a joy to coach.
I was delighted to take on Michael in a coaching role, as it was obvious there was so much room for improvement.
Gold or no gold, the data will enable Michael to see whether he's improved, and if he keeps improving, he'll develop a sense of progress and maybe a feeling of success.
There's the execution of a performance, as it were, or a race, and then afterwards there's a reflection of whether you won or not. Did you enjoy it or not? Because you can actually enjoy, I'm talking about a bike race at the minute. You can enjoy the whole race. Great performance, all working out, but you might not have won.
So Peter, you thought that average heart rate, which is 123 beats per minute, is a reasonable heart rate for that kind of ride for somebody like me?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that was a ride that we completed.
But what has all of this got to do with joy?
So the average heart
The missing link is learning. Mastering something you didn't previously know or understand is truly joyful, and the ability to learn is greatly enhanced by the data. For Michael, though, the data, joy, and a great coach make up for the lack of talent.
Yes, the very professional, if rather devastating, voiceover was done by my son-in-law, who enjoyed it a lot. Now, that belated cycling career is not going to lead to success in any recognised form, and there will be patches of it when it's anything but fun, but there will be joy. There'll be joy of achievement when I complete rides, as I do occasionally, that a year ago I would have ruled out totally. The joy of experience in a landscape in a way that you can't do in a car, and the joy, above all, that comes from learning new knowledge and new skills that the poet George Herbert a few hundred years ago called something understood. And here, without that doubt, the data, along with the coach, Peter, whom you saw in the brief film, play a vital part. The data raise questions and provide an evidence base, but to make sense of them requires interpretation, and for that, conversation is the key. Peter's deep knowledge of cycling, along with the dialogue between us about the data, bring the learning, and the learning and the application of that learning bring the joy. So the data, far from being in opposition to the joy, is actually an important ingredient of it. And that actually might be all there is to say on the whole subject, except for the fact that there are 4 misconceptions about data which need some attention if this argument is to be sustained. And the first misconception, thank you, Ryan, timing's impeccable, is this: the growing ubiquity of data in our lives undermines creativity and inspiration. It's worth noting Dave Brailsford's point in the film that the joy in an endeavour is sometimes retrospective. You look back on a cycle ride, or indeed anything, which at the time just felt very, very hard, and you realise that actually at that moment everything aligned: your fitness, your mental state, your bike, the landscape you were riding through, and you felt that sense of flow that psychologists talk about. These moments do occasionally occur spontaneously, but in cycling, and actually in many, many activities, they're much more likely to occur as a result of explicit learning, training, practice, experience, and coaching. To play the Beethoven violin concerto may well be joyful, even sublime, but it doesn't happen without a lot of hard work in advance and perhaps misery behind the scenes. The point is, though, that the listener may experience the joy without the hard work, but the hard work is still essential to the performance. In fact, you could argue that part of the pleasure in viewing a great painting or a great performance is that you can experience the joy without all the hard work. And this, of course, may be the reason why so many people peddle the myth that data undermines creativity and undermines the joy that may come from it. In a world where the performer takes the strain and the onlooker experiences the joy, then for the majority, data and joy are indeed separated. We hear the concerto, watch the play, see the match, but we don't have to experience the disciplined regime based on data and feedback which made the performance possible. And as the data and the means of gathering it become ubiquitous, we can actually all share the data now, and if we choose, we can share the pain. I can't and never will be able to cycle remotely as well as the professionals, but in the modern world, I can use all the tools they use to improve their performance to try to improve mine. It's true that in doing that, some of the mystique of top performance is lost, and with it, the element of joy that comes from surprise, but in its place, I get a deeper understanding of what top performance demands, and there is genuine joy in that. It's tempting to think that somehow the joy that comes from mystique is preferable to the joy that comes from understanding. But if you accept that argument, then you undermine the whole idea of learning and indeed potentially science altogether. But in spite of this, the critics of data often seem to be winning the argument. They make the case that it's not just creativity that's at odds with data, it's inspirational leadership too. In literature, perhaps the most famous inspirational leader is Shakespeare's Henry V. On the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, the 700th anniversary of which, incidentally, will be celebrated this year in England, but not in France. Shakespeare provides Henry V with the magnificent St. Crispin's Day speech, the most famous rendering of which was given by Laurence Olivier in 1944, another year in which the British, this time with Americans and indeed Australians alongside them, invaded northern France.
This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day.
You can't help be moved by the power of the speech and Laurence Olivier's delivery, especially if you think about it in the context of 1944. But don't be fooled into thinking that this wonderful speech, or whatever the real Henry said on the eve of Agincourt, actually won the battle. The speech might have contributed, but it would have been like chaff in the wind without careful preparation. On Henry V's behalf, someone counted the bows, someone filled the quivers with arrows, ensured they crossed the channel, and gave them to the archers, who in fact decided the battle. Inspiration with detailed planning, based on data, made the victory possible. I'm in favour of inspirational leadership. I'm also in favour of those condemned as bean counters. Not one or the other, both. Someone has to count the beans. This is the day-to-day reality of every great enterprise, whether exploring the further flung corners of science, managing a company, or leading an educational institution such as a school, a university, or a library. The daily grind, informed by whatever data is available, is as important as the inspiration. And any joy that is felt by the staff or the users of the service depends at least as much on the data as it does on the inspiration. Moreover, the better the data, the greater the efficiency. In other words, improved data will reduce the grind and maximize the inspiration, and therefore the potential for joy. So far from being in contradiction with joy, therefore, good data makes it more likely. Which leads to the second misconception. It's widely held belief that somehow, as the data improves and strengthens and becomes ubiquitous, that it was in conflict with human judgment, or indeed that it's actually replacing human judgment. People tell you, as if you needed telling, that not everything can be measured. As a statement of the obvious, this is of course harmless, but as an excuse for not gathering data, which is sometimes how it's deployed, it's dangerous. After all, as Douglas Hubbard comments, measurement can be defined merely as a set of observations that reduce uncertainty. But this misconception goes further too. There are plenty of people who reject the point I've just made but still advocate evidence-based policy as if the evidence on its own, based presumably on data, will tell you what to do in any given situation. This is not the case. If it were remotely likely that the data would tell you what to do, it would happen first in some cerebral activity that was distant from day-to-day reality. And in fact, on the 12th of May 1997, I thought exactly this would happen. That was the day a computer called Deep Blue beat the then world chess champion, one of the all-time greats, Garry Kasparov. I thought a line had been crossed. Up until that day, human intelligence beat machines. After that day, the reverse. Remarkably, in spite of Moore's law and the incredible increases in computing power since then, that is not what's happened. The brilliant young Norwegian Magnus Carlsen, who recently defended his world chess championship status successfully, is still able to beat the best computers. How can that possibly be? He says it's because the computing power now available enables him to synthesize better than any of his predecessors what is already known. And then he adds a twist of human ingenuity. The eagle of computing power carries him to previously unreached heights, and then the wren of human judgment clinches the extra inches that bring victory. I find this heartwarming, an affirmation of humanity. If it's true in as abstract an activity as chess, how much more so in policy, whether in government, business, or a public institution, such as a hospital or a school? Data informs. Humans have to exercise judgment. The point applies at the micro level as well as the macro, the classroom as well as the school, the operating theatre as well as the hospital. The evidence is extremely valuable, of course, and provides insights into what is likely to work and what isn't. But it doesn't tell you what to do. Nor does it tell you how ambitious to be. In setting goals, analysis of the data and benchmarking will certainly provide valuable insights, but it is still your decision what to do. In other words, the setting of a goal requires both analysis of the data and human judgment. Sir Dave Brailsford, who we met in the film, extends this case when setting a goal, in his case at the founding of Team Sky, that they would win the Tour de France within 5 years. He says you should, in addition to studying the data, analyse the demands of the event. What does it take to win the Tour de France? They go through it systematically. To reach answers, they would ask further questions such as, what does it demand physiologically of the cyclist? What does it demand psychologically of the cyclist? What does it demand in technique terms? Technically, what's required of the bicycle itself? And finally, what does it demand tactically? Within the rules, what is possible? The second winner of the Tour de France in 1904, it turned out had made a tactical innovation too far and ridden several of the stages on a train and was disqualified. In fact, Team Sky have indeed analysed thoroughly the data to decide how to win the Tour de France, and in fact they won it twice within the first 5 years of their existence. But the ambition came from Sir David Brailsford and his very human team. He has lots of data analysts on his team, but he also has Fran Miller, whose job title is Head of Winning Behaviours. What a fantastic job title. I want that job. So it should be clear by now that the data doesn't tell you what to do. Only the data combined with judgment and analysis will get you to a decision. But there remains a further, even more important aspect of deciding what to do, not what is possible, but what is right. And here again, the data can inform, but otherwise offers no guide at all. While I was working in Downing Street, my colleagues and I discovered by reading in the newspaper, as it happens, that 5,000 people a year died in hospital from infections that they had caught after they had been admitted to hospital. We were shocked. When I raised it with the country's top health official, he commented, "It's always been like that. Hospitals are dangerous places." I found the complacency as frightening as the facts and said the state of affairs was morally unacceptable. Imagine I asked if 5,000 people in Britain a year died in a plane crash or plane crashes. We took on the issue of hospital-acquired infections, and within 2 years had reduced the number to 3,500. Still unacceptable, but undoubtedly progress. Here, in the case of the top official, we have a not unusual case of deep expertise being used to justify the data rather than to change it. It took naive outsiders to bring the moral challenge to bear. If you allow the data to be deterministic, inevitable, inadvertently, you accept a morally unacceptable status quo. You have to decide what is morally right. The data won't tell you, and as well as in the famous phrase, what works. The data will help with the what works, but it won't help with the moral decision. Which leads to a third misconception, that somehow in teaching and education and some other professions, the data will replace professional judgment. Professions and their ethics developed long ago because we were thinking about trust. We can't all know what we need to know to ensure our good health or the success of our education, so we trust professions. And implicit is a belief that the professions have the expertise and the ethical perspective to make good decisions on our behalf when we don't know. We accept that there will be mistakes because individual situations are complicated, but we expect that those mistakes will be in good faith. As data in the fields of health and education becomes more ubiquitous, it's not unreasonable that we should expect the relevant professions to take that data into account. When we hear professions rejecting or questioning data and trying to defend secrecy, we're right to be suspicious. It was as a result of often finding myself in government days in this unproductive loop that I began to think about the idea of informed professional judgment, which is illustrated in the diagram on the screen now. In the late 1970s, when I started teaching just north of London, I don't think it was all that different in Australia. After a year's theoretical training with a couple of brief teaching practices, you qualified and started teaching. Someone shoved you through a classroom door on your first day, and after that you were on your own. You sank or swam. Hardly anyone came to see you teach, and such advice as you did get was from an experienced teacher over coffee by a battered kettle in the corner of the staff room. This is what I call uninformed professional judgment. There were, of course, great teachers, but there was no systematic attempt to build a body of proven practice and share it across the profession. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, governments increasingly aware of the importance of education to the future productivity and economic growth of countries began to try to reform this palpably inadequate state of affairs. The seminal moment in Britain was actually just before I began my teaching career, when on the 18th of October 1976 at Ruskin College in Oxford, the underestimated Jim Callaghan became the first Prime Minister in British history to make a major speech about education. Gently, he reminded the teaching profession, quote, "The balance was wrong in the past. We have a responsibility now to see that we do not get it wrong again in the other direction. There's no virtue in producing socially well-adjusted members of society who are unemployed because they do not have the skills, nor, at the other extreme, must they be technically efficient robots. Both require the same essential tools: basic literacy, basic numeracy, the understanding of how to live and work together, respect for others, and respect for the individual." Incredibly, this gentle prime ministerial admonition caused a storm of controversy. The bigger problem, though, was that governments, Jim Callaghan's included, didn't know at that point what good government-led reform looked like. They knew only how to spend money and build schools. We had entered the era of uninformed prescription, which went on to dominate the 1980s and early 1990s. Eventually, with enough mistakes accumulated across the world, as well as some successes, governments became more effective at education reform. Research in fields such as school effectiveness and school improvement, often with great Australians such as Barry McCaw, Tony McKay, Brian Caldwell, Peter Hill in the lead, provided a knowledge base. Governments around the world began to embark on a whole system reform agenda. The impressive rise of Singapore became widely noticed, along with progress in US states such as North Carolina. We in Britain, among others, watched with interest. And then there was the Blair administration in England, where we unashamedly used central power to try to shift outcomes. We made mistakes, but we also made a positive difference to student achievement. This was an era of informed prescription. We'd worked out the basic characteristics of successful whole system reform. But this process could only take us so far. Governments can mandate adequacy, but they can't mandate greatness. Greatness instead has to be unleashed. And that requires the next phase, the phase we're entering now, which is informed professionalism. And here the government's role is to create circumstances in which change is possible while teachers and principals lead the way to greatness. And part of the context for that leadership must be good, close to real-time data at classroom, school, and system level. Only in that way can we put the informed in informed professionalism. Globally, what you see when this is debated is we're in a transition phase with some school teachers and some school leaders embracing transparency and data-informed practice, while others, aided and abetted sometimes by so-called experts, stand blockheadedly against the gathering or use of any data at all. Indeed, there are some teacher unions in the world that still oppose classroom observation, implicitly longing for a return to uninformed professionalism in spite of its obvious inadequacy. So where's the joy in all this? There are some who argue that the data and measurement have replaced the joy in teaching. They recall a golden age before governments worried about performance of education systems, when teachers were individuals, when there was less pressure for outcomes, when Mr. Chips was alive and well. And there were indeed back then teachers whose lessons were joyful and whom students remember. But the dark side of that reality needs remembering too. A majority of students leaving school with few qualifications, disaffected students who in effect did deals with their teachers, we won't bother you if you don't bother us, racism that went unchallenged, girls who too often weren't expected to do well. There was no golden age. And the genuine joy for some was outweighed by the misery for many who left school to find themselves totally unprepared for the dramatic demands of the late 20th century. By contrast, informed professional judgment, aided by digital technology and informed by excellent data, has potential to unleash a transformation of teaching and learning, which in turn could drive greatly enhanced performance. It will be demanding and challenging, but if we believe that learning itself has the capacity to bring joy, then the future of education will be a great deal more joyful than the past. Indeed, for many students, the present is already far more joyful than it was for previous generations. Moreover, there is joy for the teacher as well as the student, the profound joy that comes from bending the arc of a child's prospects towards success. So if I reject the idea of evidence-based policy, does that mean I reject evidence? I hope I've made clear that's not the case. What I advocate, I call evidence-informed policy and informed professionalism, because it makes clear that any decision requires more than evidence. It requires judgment, analysis, and ethics too. If you put it in a mathematical equation, it might look like this. In short, data and professional judgment are not in conflict. They go together, which leads to the fourth and final misconception, that the data will be abused by governments and businesses, so we shouldn't collect it. We're drowning in what my colleague John Behrens calls the digital ocean. Every electronic transaction, every mobile telephone call, every email, every text can be recorded and stored, not just by the sender and receiver, but by the carrier. And much of that data can sometimes be intercepted too. People are understandably outraged when they discover that government agencies or businesses might be intercepting or collecting data without their knowledge. As education and learning go online, data is increasingly being captured at the level of individual mouse clicks about both individual learners and massive groups. Such data provides huge opportunities for analysis, which could in turn lead to significant improvements in the quality of education, but simultaneously, clearly, it carries risks and threats to privacy. The joy in this comes from the extraordinary capacity to enhance learning. I keep coming back to my bicycle because it provides a light-hearted, non-threatening, unless you count the odd broken bone I've suffered this year, way of exploring the issues at stake in this lecture. The data that computer gathers as I cycle can be shared not just with my coach, whom you saw in the film, but through websites such as Strava. As a result, I can benchmark my rides on a particular stretch of road or one of Devon's brutal hills, as you saw in the film, against countless other riders whom I never meet. And thus I both compete and learn simultaneously. In this way, I take control of my own learning. The data is part of that, and I become an informed learner, and I promise you, there is some joy in that. The data and technology have therefore hugely enhanced the capacity to learn, and we, humanity, applying that generally across all of learning, have barely begun to tap the potential of that new capacity. So what about the moral dilemmas? Is there a simple answer? I don't think so. The solution is certainly not to avoid collecting and learning from the data. That would be not just Luddite, it would be to miss the opportunity to put the science into the science of learning. So I'm left with the argument to which I keep coming back, namely that we collectively, whole societies, individuals, schools, institutions, have to take responsibility for the ethics that surround the explosion of data and try to create regulatory frameworks that maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. If you ask most people most of the time, they advocate both transparency and privacy. They're both important ideas, they're both necessary, and at the same time, they're clearly in tension. The challenge for the moment is for the ethics to keep up with the rapidly advancing frontier of the data revolution. But the key thing is this: the problem is not the data. The issues, both ethical and statistical, relate to how human beings choose to make use of the data. The risk is that through the false interpretation of data, or through a failure to recognize that the data is incomplete, human beings mislead themselves, or worse, that one group of human beings intentionally deceives another. This is why, when I was working in Downing Street, I always urged my wonderful statisticians to be not just data analysts, but the conscience of the whole operation. Did the data stand up the story, or didn't it? That was a moral, ethical perspective as well as a data perspective. These distinctions are important because if you blame the data, you might choose to avoid collecting it, whereas once you realize that the people are in control, you can focus on their capacity to make good use of the data that is available. So, with the misconceptions laid to rest, or at least I hope I've tried to do so, we can turn to what this might mean for education reform. Let's imagine for a moment a teacher who began her career in 2005 and retires in 2040. Soon after her retirement, she's sitting in a rocking chair on a veranda looking at, and you can choose the view, it might be the Blue Mountains or the North Devon coast near where I live, or even the great cityscape of Rio de Janeiro. Her grandson walks over to her and asks her what she did in her career. She could say, teaching became more and more of a chore. It wore me out. My colleagues and I fought tooth and nail to preserve the old teaching profession, where the teacher ruled the classroom, decided the curriculum and prepared the lesson plans, and was left alone to do so. We held off as much as we could the tide of change that governments driven by economic imperatives and technology pursued. I became a teacher to make a difference, but I look back and I think I hardly did. And then she could say to the grandson, I hope you won't become a teacher. Or she could say, I thank my lucky stars that I became a teacher when I did. I had gained enough experience by the time the technology and data revolution came that I could seize it along with my colleagues and make it work for our students. Once we adopted informed professionalism as our mantra, the transformation fell into place both for us and government. We became the creators of the future. The technology became ubiquitous. The data helped us map the path forward for every student. Individually and collectively, we were able to demonstrate the huge difference we made, not just to students, but to society as a whole. Sorry, I'm getting carried away with the jargon. What am I saying? It was challenging. It was deeply rewarding. Sometimes it was joyful. And I hope one day you will become a teacher too. What would it take in terms of education reform to ensure the latter scenario rather than the former? Well, first, we need to think about the purpose of school. It is important at school that students learn the knowledge, master the skills, and develop the attitudes that will enable them to succeed in the 21st century. But we shouldn't think of school as being solely about preparation for the future, but also as a productive place where today matters, because every day matters. My good friend Peter Hyman set up a beautiful free school in the East End of London called School 21. The simple, profound purpose of the school, he says, is, quote, to produce beautiful work. Each piece of work the students produce, whatever the subject, whatever its nature, is important in and for itself. Peter doesn't advocate this because he doesn't care how well the students do in traditional exams. It's true that he would like to see an assessment revolution, and that is indeed required. But in the meantime, he fully expects his students to succeed in traditional exams because of, not in spite of, the emphasis on beautiful work. There are two implications of his thinking that I want to draw out. First, the thinking is based on that of a craftsman or a craftswoman, and they have always valued precision and data. Precision and measurement on the one hand, and beauty and joy go together for the craftsman. Why so often in education have we seen them as in contradiction? And second, the leadership of the kind that Peter is bringing about can only come from among educators, not among government. Government can create the circumstances in which that kind of leadership is more likely, but it can't make it happen. So unless bold leaders from within the education systems step forward, as Peter and many others around the world are doing, the necessary transformation will not occur. So with this background, let's have a look at what the transformation might look like, starting from a student's perspective. In a report I wrote with my friend and colleague Simon Day for the state of Massachusetts last year, we tried to describe a high school in 2030 in the following words. A lot of the content you need to succeed in high school in 2030, you could now get online at home. There were numerous sources recommended by the school. For example, the state's leading universities such as Harvard and MIT incentivized their professors to produce online lectures with marvelous graphics specifically for high school students. Even so, going into school each morning was still the expectation. As always, the social aspects of school had their appeal, but the motivational power of the whole learning experience was now of a different order. No 2 days were the same. They involved a different mix of individual study, teamwork focused on solving problems, seminar discussions, and one-to-one sessions with a personal tutor, reviewing progress on an individual learning plan and thinking through the next steps. Sometimes the school as a whole would focus on some major issue affecting the community and apply its educational and human capital to solving the problem with the community. Students' learning profiles describe their progress not just on these academic outcomes, but their progress in learning leadership, interpersonal and teamworking skills that the economy by then valued so highly. Since 2015, many school buildings had been redesigned, with some of the old classrooms being let as design studios, start-up incubation spaces, and offices. Increasingly, as students moved towards graduation, the school was a place where learning and work seemed to merge. Just as in workplaces across the country, work and learning were becoming synonymous. Note how in the description of this description of the school of the future, the data is ubiquitous, measuring progress not just on academic performance, but also on wider skills and attributes. Notice also how the implied totally transformed classroom, or maybe we should say learning space, has been transformed, is open, flexible, with ubiquitous technology, very like, as it happens, the wonderful young people in my team at Pearson designed for us, and you can see their design behind me. In spaces such as these, the teacher is no longer a transmitter of knowledge, though she or he may do this periodically, but nor is he or she a mere facilitator either. The role is that of activator in John Hattie, the wonderful professor from Melbourne, in John Hattie's evocative phrase, someone who injects the ambition. This is the teacher who injects the ambition, provokes the thought, asks great questions, challenges mediocrity, and brings passion and insight to the task at hand, and who at the same time, drawing on excellent data, has a clear, personalized picture of every student in the class. As a result, the teacher is in a position to have an informed conversation with each student about where they are, where they might want to go, and how they might get there. Many schools already keep precise records which they share and discuss with the student and their family. And the more those records go into the wider areas that matter to the future success in society and the economy, the better. This has power to unlock potential in ways that were never possible before. In addition, of course, for the teacher to be like that, the teacher needs to be part of a team of informed professionals preparing programs for students. I read every now and again on Twitter recently, for example, that teachers in the future will be learning designers, not implementers. But actually, I think that's nonsense. They will be learning designers, but they'll be implementers too, to move to another field. Imagine if Mitchell Johnson recently had redesigned his bowling action, but not put it into action to destroy England. Actually, I'd be happier thinking about it. Moreover, the teacher, assisted by the providers of online materials, which will then, and already are beginning to replace textbooks, will have access to data from far beyond the school that will enable them to answer such questions as, precise as this: has anyone successfully taught this sequence of geometry to a group of Turkish boys who are in danger of falling behind? And if so, how did they do that? The teachers who solve such problems, by the way, won't necessarily have to wait to be asked. They can post lesson plans and videos in easily usable formats for their fellow professionals to draw on. They could, if we wanted to, receive a royalty every time their solution is downloaded, just as an artist does on iTunes. In this way, innovation will be built into the way the entire teaching profession works. Occasionally, there will be a major breakthrough, but just as importantly, continuous improvement will be integral. Our friend Sir David Brailsford calls this the aggregation of marginal gains, the constant testing and refinement of small details that in cycling make the difference between victory and defeat, and in teaching between progress and stagnation. And this, of course, has implications for school leadership too. We will want instructional leaders, of course. Our schools will need to be capable of recognizing, our school leaders will need to be capable of recognizing and inspiring excellence while also challenging mediocrity and questioning it. They'll need to spark innovative thinking and make decisions about when to unleash a radical experiment and when to hold back. But this will not be enough. They will also need to think strategically. As Michael Fullan and Caitlin Donnelly argue in Alive in the Swamp, they will need to understand that the digital revolution will only bring transformation in outcomes if they, the school leaders, simultaneously change pedagogy and school organization. All three need to change at once. And finally, school leaders will need to engage parents and communities in a continuous dialogue about education and its implications for learners and society as a whole. Such analysis of the future is influencing education providers and companies too. At Pearson, we've put educational outcomes at the heart of our strategy, and my team is responsible for ensuring that all of our products and services become capable of demonstrating their impact on learning outcomes. Enabling these radical changes across systems is the task of government too, of course. Politics varies across time and place, but the task everywhere I would define in one word: stewardship, seeking always to leave the system better than you found it. What does it take to be a steward in this new era? Well, first, government needs to set strategy and direction, looking 5, 10, or even 25 years ahead to do so. It needs to interpret the world and to think through the implications for the system. In part, this is an analytical task, increasingly involving dialogue with other countries informed by benchmarking data such as PISA, but it's also more than that. There's a desperate need for government to open up dialogue with people and to level with them in plain language about what lies ahead. And one central fact about the 21st century is this: for any person with a great education and the capacity to keep learning, the world is one of boundless opportunity. For anyone without those attributes, by contrast, it's a threatening and unforgiving century. The second thing that matters in this stewardship role is setting the rules and providing the data that enables performance to be understood and decisions to be informed at every level, from classroom to country. As Margaret Spellings, the former US Education Secretary, used to say, "In God we trust, for everything else we need data." And increasingly, this data should be publicly available and open to analysis by anyone with an interest in doing so. Third, there does need to be a growing emphasis on funding education, which is vital, but also on spending the money wisely, not just because we live in an era of austerity, but also because people's willingness to pay taxes shows no sign of increasing. Yet their aspirations for major improvements in government services, including education, is not diminishing either. Fortunately, the quality of the data and the growing evidence base should enable precision targeting of policy instead of blanket regulation. This should have the double benefit of being both more effective and more efficient. Take a look at this map of the 36 districts of Punjab. We have data like this in the Punjab Education Reform every month from 55,000 schools. It enables us to look at where the challenges are across the province. The Chief Minister and the team look at these maps each month, and they direct their efforts precisely to where the problems are, and you can see them very vividly on the maps. When the Chief Minister first saw these maps a couple of years ago, he said, "I'm going to sleep with these under my pillow." Of course, the government there retains the capacity to intervene when there are major problems, but most of their actions now are much more targeted. This is just one example of how data enables precision, and if they can do it in Punjab, there's no excuse for not doing it anywhere else. Regulation, of course, will remain important to ensure fairness and appropriate use of public funds, but increasingly it should be less like traditional regulation and more like tending a garden. This is indeed the implication of the whole nudge argument, which many of you will be familiar with, under which citizens are empowered and given choice, and the government role becomes one of putting in place choice architecture and incentivizing the behaviors that benefit the wider community as well as the individual. None of this is possible without a regular flow of good real-time data. Fourth, and finally, government has a responsibility to ensure the supply, capacity, culture and quality of the key professions in any service. The key to this in relation to the teaching profession is the case I made earlier for informed professionalism. And for teachers and their leaders as well, it's important that they, along with government, put learning outcomes, short and long term, at the heart of their dialogue. Once it becomes a steward in the sense I've described, government will rely on data, but it won't become the provider of joy. During Blair's second term, while I was in Downing Street, the Department for Education in England published a policy document on primary education called Excellence and Enjoyment. My friend, the former Secretary of State for Education at that time, the Home Secretary, wrote me a note in which he said, the next one will be called Happy If Not Excellent. We found the title absurd, not because we were opposed to enjoyment in primary schools, far from it, but because I don't think the government should have a policy on it. Government's role is not to provide enjoyment or joy, but to create the conditions in which they become possible and even likely for teachers and students across a country. I've often said before that the road to hell in education is paved with false dichotomies, joy and data, risk becoming another one. Let's reclaim them. Let's unite them in pursuit of an education for everyone that is rich, deep and fulfilling. That way, we will enable future generations here in Australia and elsewhere to seize the immense opportunities that lie ahead. Thank you very much for your attention.